They are some of the most dangerous foes that player characters have ever battled. Acererak the Devourer, architect of the infamous Tomb of Horrors, and Tar-Baphon the Whispering Tyrant. Today, we are going to take these two masters of necromancy and put them in a battle with one another to determine which Arch-Lich is ultimately the greatest on today's episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who is trying to achieve a kill count on par with Gary Gygax. I've got a few thousand PCs to go. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we're going to be doing a fun versus battle, taking one of the most famous D&D villains and one of the most famous Pathfinder villains, putting them into a head-to-head match and determining ultimately which villain would come out on top in a battle to the death. They are Acererak the Devourer, Arch-Lich behind the construction of the Tomb of Horrors, and Tar-Baphon the Whispering Tyrant. Now, these two villains have some incredible stories and share a lot of similarities between one another, which we are going to get into in today's video. The Lich is a classic villain in tabletop RPGs, an undead spellcaster that has permanently severed their soul from their body, making themselves almost impossible to destroy. They may be driven by a desire for dark knowledge, an urge to conquer, or an utter hatred of life itself, but in one fashion or another, the Lich has served as an all-too-familiar villain for characters inside of TTRPGs, and today we are taking two of the heaviest hitters, Acererak and Tar-Baphon, and we are going to have them battle it out to decide, ultimately, which Arch-Lich comes out on top. Now, both of these villains have spanned multiple editions of the various games that they are a part of, and have accomplished some incredible feats of villainy in a variety of settings, making these two titans of necromancy clear contenders for the most powerful liches in fantasy RPGs. And I think that's why these two make for such an interesting battle. Now really quick, in researching for this video, I have tried to research the history of both characters through every edition of the game that they have appeared in. And I even want to give a shout out to Mark Seifter for helping me dig up some information on Tar-Baphon and his backstory for the Golarion Setting. I will be throwing some reference links into the video description so that you can see some of the sources that I'm pulling from for this particular battle analysis. In specific, for this comparison, I'm going to be pulling Acererak's latest printed statistics as a CR23 Lich from the Tomb of Annihilation adventure for D&D 5e. And I'm also going to be pulling Tar-Baphon's statistics as printed in the book Mythic Realms for Pathfinder 1st Edition, which lists him at a CR of 26 and a Mythic rank of 10. Now, it is worth noting I am going to be considering other sources as well, and looking at other feats and accomplishments from these two characters, but those were kind of the baselines that I was using for comparison. But one thing that I want to stress as we dive into this comparison between Acererak and Tar-Baphon, it is very clear that both of these characters are incredibly powerful. They exist inside different game systems, but the reality is, if you were to translate Acererak over to either edition of Pathfinder or Tar-Baphon into Dungeons & Dragons, when those characters would translate over, they would translate over to a very incredible power scale. Saying CR23 in one system versus CR26 in another system is not a good face comparison, because the reality is both of these characters would be some of the highest tier threats imaginable inside of their setting. So be aware that while I am using those as points of comparison, that I don't consider those basic numbers to be the end-all be-all of which character is more powerful. In fact, in today's analysis, I'll go ahead and tell you that determining a winner between Acererak and Tar-Baphon is very much a battle of degrees. Both of them are incredibly intelligent. Both of them have incredible reserves of necromantic power. Both are very cunning. Both are very durable. And determining which one is superior to the other in any given category is always going to be a very narrow difference between the two. I think these two combatants are very well matched against one another, and to that degree, before even declaring who I think would win between the two, I will say that there are very obvious scenarios where either of the two could emerge victorious, meaning that it is definitely a close match. So, to that effect, I invite you all to jump in and be a part of the conversation. Go down in the comments section and let me know where you agree with my analysis, where you disagree. Let me know if there are elements of either of their stories you feel I have overlooked or weighed incorrectly. And let me know who you think would ultimately come out on top in a battle between these two incredible liches. And while you're engaging in that conversation, don't forget to do all of the other YouTube stuff. If you enjoy this video, please like it, please share the video. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe to the channel. Also, you can join my free Discord or check out my Patreon, both of which will be linked in the video description as well. Alright, so let's lay the ground rules for how I'm going to decide between these two combatants. For this battle, I'm going to be comparing Acererak and Tar-Baphon along 6 different categories: intelligence, allies, mastery of the environment, equipment, survivability, and offense or overall necromantic power. After examining which character would come out on top of each of those individual categories, then we'll take a look at the overall picture and declare an ultimate winner. So, let's get started. Alright, so first let's introduce our combatants. The first Arch-Lich to enter the arena is Acererak the Devourer. Back in the 1980s, the legendary Gary Gygax decided to create a new and particularly deadly dungeon that came to be known as the Tomb of Horrors. Overseeing this deadly labyrinth was its creator, Acererak the Devourer. Acererak was born as a Cambrian, which is not exactly but similar to a tiefling in the Oerth setting, also known as Greyhawk. And early in life, he took up the study of necromancy under the patronage of the evil deity Vecna, who noted that the young Acererak seemed to possess a deep hatred of life itself. After Vecna was betrayed by his vampire servant Cass, Acererak went on his own and continued his necromantic studies, eventually building a dungeon that he could use to devote himself to the search for knowledge. This dungeon became known as the Tomb of Horrors. As his knowledge and power grew, Acererak eventually chose to become a Lich and turned the Tomb of Horrors into a malignant death trap designed to lure adventurers to their untimely demise. The Tomb of Horrors was filled with all kinds of incredible treasures that would appeal to adventurers and cause them to delve into the dungeon in hope of striking it rich and making a name for themselves. And some adventurers could even claim to have made it to the heart of the Tomb of Horrors itself, to have fought Acererak and claimed some of his greatest treasures. However, certainly many perished along the way, and unfortunately for the few that thought they had overcome the challenges, Acererak proved quite devious and had avoided true destruction. You see, those adventurers never faced the true Acererak, and he was hidden much deeper within the tomb. The adventurers had taken down a false version of himself, And the true purpose of the tomb was to serve as a sort of soul collector. As adventurers came in seeking wealth and glory, and dying along the way, their souls were collected in the heart of the Tomb of Horrors for, well, we don't exactly know what Acererak was up to, but we can go ahead and assume it was definitely something dark and dangerous. Many people suspect that Acererak was trying to merge his consciousness with the plane of negative entropy itself. Acererak's story does not end there. Now, some variations of Acererak's story claims that he became a demi-lich. However, different editions of Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder have varied in their interpretation of what a demi-lich is. Some editions present a demi-lich as a more powerful version of a lich, and others present the demi-lich as a degraded version of a lich that is essentially slowly losing its mind. The current edition of D&D and Pathfinder both take that second approach, so for this video, I'm not going to be looking at the demi-lich version of Acererak, because the current editions of the games both assume that the demi-lich would actually be the weaker version of the character. Though to be completely fair, in some editions, the demi-lich version would be considered the stronger version, and you could even make an argument that the demi-lich might be more powerful magically, but at the same time might also be losing its mental faculties. That's a debate with just a few too many threads for the purpose of this video. If we were to follow that particular thread, in Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition, Acererak actually becomes a vestige that is capable of granting some of its power to mortal spellcasters. I would say that a vestige is probably on par with a warlock or witch patron in the current editions of D&D and Pathfinder, but that's a little bit speculative on my part. I don't know for sure. In the current canon storyline for D&D 5e, Acererak eventually travels to the Forgotten Realms, to the nation of Chult, where he overcomes the 9 trickster gods of the Omu. He then traps the spirits of those trickster gods inside of a new dungeon of his creation that came to be known as the Tomb of the 9 Gods, or more commonly as the Tomb of Annihilation from the adventure of the same name. At the bottom of this tomb, Acererak buried the Atropal, the stillborn husk of a deity that had been tossed into the negative energy plane. Using an artifact called the Soulmonger, Acererak was able to corrupt resurrection magic all over Toril and create what became known as the Death Curse that would siphon off the souls of people who benefited from resurrection magic and essentially drain those souls into the Atropal, presumably under the goal of allowing the Atropal to be raised as some sort of powerful new deity at the command or at least service of Acererak himself. Ultimately, a group of adventurers were able to infiltrate the Tomb of the 9 Gods, they were able to defeat the Atropal, and they were able to overcome Acererak himself through the help of the spirits of the 9 trickster deities. Still, despite his setbacks, Acererak holds a clear position of power and control over necromantic magic and is a dangerous threat for anyone that might come to face this powerful lich. Our second contender today is Tar-Baphon the Whispering Tyrant. Now, Tar-Baphon originally appeared in the Game Master's Complete Encounters series, written by Sean K. Reynolds, before the Golarion Setting was even published. Later, when the Golarion Setting was published, and on into the publication of Pathfinder as its own gaming system, Jason Bowman was responsible for a lot of the work, transferring Tar-Baphon from that original publication to his final version inside of the Golarion campaign setting. I don't know for sure if Sean Reynolds was the first person to write about Tar-Baphon, or if he was just the first person requested at Paizo, but Sean and Jason seem to be the 2 primary authors behind this incredible character. The actual origins of Tar-Baphon are a little bit shrouded in mystery. What is known is that he is a human from the region that would eventually be known as Ustalov, and that he spent much of his early life studying necromancy before eventually conquering what would become known as the Isle of Terror. After that, Tar-Baphon in a bid to increase his necromantic power, faced the dangerous dungeon known as the Cenotaph, which was actually designed by the Rune Lord of Necromancy, and after overcoming the Cenotaph and increasing his necromantic power, Tar-Baphon would take over the whole of the Isle of Terror and attract a large army of orcs and undead that he brought together with the intention of conquering the world. Eventually, Tar-Baphon caught the attention of the god Eredin and ended up in a battle with Eredin. Tar-Baphon sought to capture Eredin in a dungeon he created known as the Well of Sorrows, but he was not successful, and Eredin struck him down. And, so it seemed, the threat of Tar-Baphon was ended. However, as I'm sure you can tell, there's more to the story. Years later, Tar-Baphon returns, now in the form of a Lich. It turns out that in his quest for Lichdom, Tar-Baphon had become convinced that the only suitable way to kill him in his pursuit of undeath and necromantic power was to be struck down by a god. Anything less would not give him the level of power he desired. The Well of Sorrows and his battle with Eredin were in fact a trick, and now having returned at the height of undead power, he set about conquering the nation of Ustalav. Ultimately, it took the combined effort of the Shining Crusade, the Knights of Ozum, and the Dwarves of Kragadan battling in conjunction against the now Whispering Tyrant to bring this threat down. Part of the reason that Tar-Baphon was so difficult to defeat was his mastery of necromancy had achieved such heights that any time a creature fell on either side of the battle, he could immediately return them as an undead creature under his command. During this war, the Whispering Tyrant faced off against many powerful foes. One of the foes that he defeated was Orozne, who was the Herald of Eredin. He actually managed to kill her when they fought. However, he wasn't as lucky when he battled against Arnazant, who was wielding the Shield of Eredin. The Shield of Eredin allowed Arnazant to resist the Whispering Tyrant's magic, and though the shield shattered, Tar-Baphon was badly injured and was forced to retreat. The war bringing Tar-Baphon down is described as long, brutal, and extremely costly for the forces that ultimately defeated him. He was driven back to another dungeon that he had created, the Gallows Spire, but because those forces did not know how to locate the Whispering Tyrant's soul cage, they didn't have a way to destroy him permanently, and instead they concocted a plan to seal Tar-Baphon inside his own dungeon, the Gallows Spire, where they watched over him in an effort to prevent his return for centuries. As the centuries wore on inside of Gallows Spire, Tar-Baphon schemed and plotted his return, and began to experiment with one of the fragments of the Shield of Eredin. The Shattered Shield of Arnazant fragments, as they were now known, one of those was lodged in the Whispering Tyrant's hand, and through that piece of that artifact, the Whispering Tyrant began to experiment not just with the mastery of negative energy, but also the mastery of positive energy as well, creating a weapon that would be known as Radiant Fire. Eventually, the seals containing Tar-Baphon were broken, and he was able to violently return to the world, destroying the capital of Lastval, Vigil, in a burst of Radiant Fire, and summoning hordes of undead in a march that eventually ended at the city of Absalom, where Tar-Baphon intended to climb the Starstone Tower and achieve godhood. However, outside of Absalom, the Whispering Tyrant would be stopped by a group of adventurers who managed to turn the Radiant Fire against Tar-Baphon, badly injuring him and causing him to lose his hand and connection to the Shattered Shield of Arnazant. Ultimately, Tar-Baphon was forced to retreat to the Isle of Terror, and since that retreat has also failed to recruit the orcs back into his warband. However, he is still dangerous, deadly, and plotting his revenge. The Whispering Tyrant has not given up on his goal of subjugating all of the world around him. Now, obviously, I have only given you a truncated version of both stories here, And if you would like to learn more about Acererak or Tar-Baphon, their histories and their accomplishments, check out the links in the video description. But I think we have a solid foundation, and now we can move on to comparing and contrasting the strengths and weaknesses of these two villains. Okay, now that we've got the introductions out of the way, we can move on to the different factors that I think would play into the outcome of this battle. And as I said before, we're going to be taking a look at 6 different factors: overall intelligence, allies, mastery of the environment, equipment, survivability, and offense or necromantic power. And I want to begin this conversation with the factor that I think arguably is the most important factor in this battle, and that is the intelligence of the two contenders. Acererak the Devourer and Tar-Baphon the Whispering Tyrant are both necromancers. This is essentially a subclass of the wizard class in every edition where they show up, and in every case, intelligence is the most important stat in determining the overall power of both of these contenders. So I think examining the intelligence of Acererak and Tar-Baphon is important in determining how this battle ultimately is going to go. And allow me to say that I'm going to cheat a little in this category because I consider this category so important. We're going to discuss how they compare in this category, but I'm actually going to save my who wins in this category for the end of these 6 categories, and you'll see why when I get there. On the subject of intelligence, we get our first glimpse of why I said earlier that a battle between these two necromancers truly is a battle of degrees. Both of these characters, I feel it would be completely fair to argue, have the highest possible intelligence score in any game that they would appear in. Whatever the cap is, however high you can push it, however far you want to go in any given setting or any given TTRPG, I think that Acererak and Tar-Baphon both have a case to be made for being as intelligent as it comes. They are both mental powerhouses. Acererak finds a way to curse resurrection magic across all of Toril. Tar-Baphon literally bluffs a deity. They are both incredibly intelligent opponents. This is like Sherlock versus Moriarty. Neither of these characters are going to be a slouch in this department. And that's why in this department, I think it's less useful to talk about which of these characters is more powerful and instead talk about how these characters use their intellect. Because while they are both very intelligent, I do think they tend to use their intellect in very different ways, and that is very telling for this fight. Put simply, I think that Acererak is the more cunning intelligence, and Tar-Baphon is the more focused intelligence, or you might say brutal intelligence between the two. Acererak is a very interesting character for me because on one hand he is written very much as this force of nature style villain. He is driven by a burning hatred of life. In one of the versions of his story, he's trying to merge his consciousness with the negative energy plane itself. He is a stereotypical example of the force of nature villain, but most force of nature villains are very straightforward, and Acererak is not. He is very cunning, and it's a beautiful mixture of 2 different tropes when it comes to using a villain. Think about the classic Tomb of Horrors. Acererak built this tomb as basically a soul harvester for adventurers, and even put in a false final battle that the adventurers could overcome and feel like they had succeeded, so that he could just have this constant churn of adventurers coming in to kill him and take his loot, and really, he's just constantly harvesting the souls that he needs for his plans. That is incredibly devious, and hats off to Gary Gygax. I think that is a beautiful twist on the classic Tomb of Horrors. From there, Acererak travels to the Forgotten Realms and overcomes the 9 trickster gods of the Omu. I will admit there is some lack of clarity. Are they true deities? Are they primal entities? There's some back and forth on that topic, but they are certainly powerful and they are certainly cunning creatures, the 9 trickster gods. So you have this constant theme that Acererak is constantly outwitting his foes. He's coming up with cunning strategies, he's deceiving them, luring them into traps. Time and again, Acererak relies on a deep and incredible degree of cunning in order to beat his enemies. So I think the default position for Acererak is in the form of a very cunning intellect. On the other side, you have Tar-Baphon, and Tar-Baphon, the core word for him is in his title, the Whispering Tyrant, or Tyrant. He wants to conquer the world. And the writers for Paizo, they drive this home. The Whispering Tyrant, when he has a goal, he's focused, he's brutal, and he's going to do whatever he needs to take it. It doesn't matter who he has to beat, what source of power he needs to claim. Tar-Baphon is going to find a way to chase his goals. And in certain instances, you see that this focus from Tar-Baphon turns into a very powerful weapon. After he is sealed away in Gallowspire, he turns this piece from the Shattered Shield of Arnazent into a weapon. He uses it to invent Radiant Fire, and when he's able to bust out of Gallowspire, he busts out with a new powerful mega weapon at his disposal that he is able to use to almost immediately incinerate the base of power for the people that originally entrapped him. You get this picture of the Whispering Tyrant just sitting inside Gallowspire for centuries and centuries, turning this artifact over and over in his mind until he finds a way to use it, and when he finds it, he shatters the world. Tar-Baphon is certainly incredibly focused and, in a lot of ways, very brutal. Now, that's not to say that either combatant can't pull the other's card from time to time. As previously mentioned, Tar-Baphon did successfully deceive the god Eredin, and Acererak frequently laments that he's not brutal enough in the traps that he pulls on people, and is constantly pushing himself to find new and more cruel ways to torment the souls that he's trying to collect. So, both of them can certainly play a lot of different cards under their intellect, but I think as a good generalization, Acererak the Devourer is a very cunning intellect, and Tar-Baphon the Whispering Tyrant is a very focused intellect. But which version of incredible intelligence is more important in this battle? Well, I'm going to save that for later in the video, and let's move on to some lesser aspects of these two combatants and see how they stack up. For round 2 of this comparison, I'd like to move on to an area of the battle that I don't think is nearly as decisive as the first category, but it's still something that I think is worth considering, and that is in the area of allies. Acererak the Devourer and Tar-Baphon both have allies that they can call upon in their battles against other opponents. Both of them have inspired powerful necromantic cults, both of them have called many creatures to their service, and both of them have an array of deadly people and monsters at their disposal that they could potentially use in an effort to upstage one another. And between the two of them, I think there are a couple of generalizations you can make about their advantages and disadvantages in these categories. In terms of advantages, Acererak pretty clearly has a more diverse array of allies at his disposal. Meanwhile, Tar-Baphon, to put it simply, has the numbers. He has, by far, the larger forces. We've already mentioned at one point how Tar-Baphon was able to subjugate the orcs and use them in his conquest of Ustalav, and his incredible necromantic powers allow him to very rapidly refill the undead ranks at his disposal. Very simply, Tar-Baphon is your classic necromancer. He has hordes and hordes and hordes of undead that he can use anytime he sees fit. On top of that, Tar-Baphon also has the ability to call a powerful black dragon to his service, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later. The size of Tar-Baphon's forces is clearly to his advantage here. As for Acererak, he displays greater diversity. We've already mentioned that Acererak is actually a Cambrian, which is similar to a tiefling, and his father was a Balor. One of the advantages Acererak has in this particular category is planar allies. Acererak has traveled to a number of different planes, and he has negotiated and worked with many different demons and devils during the course of his different studies. And in the Tomb of Horrors, one of the surprise monsters that you can run into is interplanar threats like demons that might show up if you use the wrong type of magic. Simply put, the skill set of Acererak's allies is more diverse than what we see with Tar-Baphon's allies. So, between the two, which of these is stronger? And in this category, I have to give it to Tar-Baphon because Acererak comes with a noted weakness, and that is Acererak is really dismissive of his allies. Whether it's cultists that are serving him, whether it's the different interplanar creatures that he has negotiated with, Acererak is portrayed time and time again in his stories as someone who really doesn't care about the people working for him and who is willing to turn on the people working for him very quickly. In fact, one of the fun questions of Acererak's story is he originally had the patronage of the evil god Vecna, but when Vecna was betrayed, Acererak was nowhere to be seen. And so there's this question, was he in on the betrayal or not? And regardless of how you answer that question, it kind of highlights the fact that Acererak, over the course of his career, will dispose of his allies very quickly, almost at the drop of a hat, and you get the sense he doesn't really take full advantage of the different creatures he works with. Now, to be fair here, Tar-Baphon is not a shoo-in in this category. Like all tyrants, he struggles to keep especially living creatures in his service. Most recently in the Golarion storyline, he has failed to bring the orcs back under his banner. So Tar-Baphon's rule is far from absolute, but you do get the sense in the way Tar-Baphon approaches his alliances and his servants that he at least makes better use of the allies and servants that he has. He is by no means a loving and kind ruler, definitely not, but I do feel overall he makes better use of what he has. So between Acererak and Tar-Baphon, when it comes to allies, Tar-Baphon's going to take the win in this category. But let's move on to round 3, and the category that I think is the most clear-cut of any category we're going to talk about in this video. That is Mastery of the Environment. Which combatant is likely to have the greatest edge on the basis of where the battle takes place? Now, I will admit the location of the battle or battles is not as significant as some of the other issues, but on this particular point, I do think we need to pause and admit Acererak wins this, hands down. There are a lot of similarities between Acererak and the Whispering Tyrant in this category. Both of them have created two, count them, two incredibly powerful necromancy-themed dungeons. The Whispering Tyrant has the Well of Sorrows and Gallows Spire, and Acererak has the classic Tomb of Horrors and the more recent Tomb of Annihilation. And while I want to give Tar-Baphon some points for clearly having some more creative naming conventions, I have to say, overall, Acererak clearly does a better job in the creation of dungeons. He knows how to manipulate an environment to his advantage, and it is clearly one of his strengths. I've already mentioned in the video that the Tomb of Horrors has a trick built into it where adventurers might think they've defeated Acererak, when in fact they've only made it about halfway through. The level of cunning that goes into a dungeon like that is just absolutely phenomenal, and one of the reasons why I think Gary Gygax is so famous of an author inside of the industry. Clearly, Acererak knows how to make a dungeon and knows how to use that dungeon to its fullest advantage. Now, in Tar-Baphon's favor here, we do have the Well of Sorrows. And the Well of Sorrows, you may remember, was originally designed to trap a god. He tries to lure Eredin in, and the trap fails, causing Eredin to strike him down, but turns out it was a trick, and Tar-Baphon intended to lose that fight. It is noted inside of the Golarion Setting that the Well of Sorrows is still active and clearly still has some purpose. The whole trap a god thing was not what it was actually meant to do, so the Well of Sorrows still has a part to play in whatever it is the Whispering Tyrant has schemed up. So, on that point, the Well of Sorrows shows that the Whispering Tyrant can create very powerful and effective dungeons. He uses it well. But Gallowspire gets turned against him. What is supposed to be the base of his power and a place for him to project his power across the face of Golarion turns into, essentially, his tomb. The Shining Crusade is able to seal Tar-Baphon away inside of Gallowspire, and until he is able to invent Radiant Fire and get the seals broken, he is essentially trapped inside. So, because Tar-Baphon has one of his dungeons turned against him, that tells me that Acererak does a far better job of using those dungeons to his advantage. There's a couple of other points here that just further land on Acererak's side of the column. Acererak has traveled further throughout the plains. He has visited more planes, he's gone more places, and while Tar-Baphon has experimented with the planes on the Isle of Terror, most of his travels are contained to Golarion specifically. So, overall, Acererak has traveled more, he has seen more places, that gives him an advantage, and you may remember, the Whispering Tyrant is a tyrant, he has the urge to conquer, which means the most likely scenario of these two facing one another would have Tar-Baphon attacking one of Acererak's locations, which Acererak knows how to turn against an attacker. So, mastery of the environment, clearly, hands down, this one goes to Acererak. But now we come to round 4, and the last of the what I would consider minor considerations in this battle, and that is the equipment of Acererak and Tar-Baphon. Now, on first blush, this seems like hands down Tar-Baphon, just because Pathfinder tends to be a more equipment-focused game. And to be fair, that is one of the differences between the system, and you have to account for that in the balancing, but it is worth noting both characters are pretty impressive in this category. Acererak repeatedly loads up the Tomb of Horrors and the Tomb of Annihilation with all of these magical items, most of which presumably he created, as lures for adventurers so that he can harvest their souls. And don't forget that Acererak is able to create this incredibly powerful artifact called the Soulmonger, which he uses to corrupt resurrection magic on a global scale. Acererak is clearly an accomplished inventor when it comes to magical items. On top of that, it is noted in his 5th edition stats that Acererak has both a Sphere of Annihilation and a Talisman of the Sphere, giving him better control of said Sphere of Annihilation. The Sphere of Annihilation is an artifact-level threat that can completely destroy any matter that touches it. Not bad. On top of that, the Sphere of Annihilation is controlled by the mental power of the person wielding it, and the only way to get bonuses to that control is with the Talisman of the Sphere, which we mentioned Acererak has. So Acererak is walking into this fight with a very potent artifact at his disposal. But Tar-Baphon is no slouch. If you read up on Tar-Baphon's known gear in Pathfinder 1st Edition, you'll find out he also has an array of magical items at his disposal, and clearly would have the ability to craft a wide array of magical items as well. He also comes equipped with 2 artifacts of his own, the Tyrant's Ring and the Horns of Nagara. The Tyrant's Ring is a minor artifact that serves both as a ring of freedom of movement and a ring of spell storing, and the Horns of Nagara are a major artifact that gives the Whispering Tyrant access to several very potent defensive abilities, and you may remember this from earlier, he can turn the Horns of Nagara into a powerful black dragon that can join him in battle. So, the Whispering Tyrant definitely has some potent options himself. How do they stack up? Well, in this category, I think that Acererak is actually better at creating equipment, but Tar-Baphon takes the win because he is better at using equipment. Let me explain. His tombs are filled to the brim with them. But those magical items are mostly being used as lures to bring adventurers into traps. And if you think about this battle between Acererak and Tar-Baphon, that's not a threat that Tar-Baphon is going to fall for. He doesn't need a magical sword. So essentially, that aspect of Acererak's equipment is null and void in this confrontation. But Acererak also has the Sphere of Annihilation, and that is something we need to consider. Now, the Sphere of Annihilation is a very powerful threat. No question about it, but remember, the Sphere of Annihilation destroys matter that it touches. Liches can regenerate over and over again so long as their soul cage remains intact. So, the Sphere of Annihilation represents a less serious threat for a Lich than it does for a regular person like you or I. So while Acererak does have a powerful weapon at his disposal, that weapon is less threatening overall versus Tar-Baphon. And remember, anyone can control a Sphere of Annihilation via their great intellect. Acererak does have an advantage because of the Talisman of the Sphere, but it's not a clear-cut win. Meanwhile, if you actually study the Sphere of Annihilation as it is presented in Pathfinder, you will discover Tar-Baphon's listed known equipment includes the necessary gear to potentially destroy the Sphere of Annihilation, removing it from the equation completely. It's not surefire, but Tar-Baphon does have the possibility of eliminating Acererak's most potent weapon from the word go. On top of that, in Pathfinder scaling, the Sphere of Annihilation is considered a minor artifact, on par with the Tyrant's Ring, but the Horns of Nagara are considered a major artifact and come with an array of very important defensive powers. Meaning that ultimately, Tar-Baphon is just better equipped. Acererak may be a more prodigious creator of magical items, but when it comes to how those items are going to be used in a confrontation, clearly Tar-Baphon's equipment is more focused on winning the fight and more useful in winning the fight, so here I've got to give Tar-Baphon the edge once again. All of that conversation on equipment is going to move us into round 5, which is a category where I think, again, Tar-Baphon is going to come out on top, and that is on the subject of survivability. And this is where we start to get into, I think, the more serious considerations on how the battle is ultimately going to go. Ultimately, I do think Tar-Baphon is the harder foe to permanently put down. Now, a couple of quick caveats. I have been looking at the CR23 version of Acererak from D&D 5e, and I've been looking at the CR26 variation of Tar-Baphon from Pathfinder 1st Edition. And again, I want to stress, you can't just take those things at face value. 23 versus 26, I don't think that's a fair comparison. And it is worth noting Both of these contenders are hard to put down. Liches are immortal for a reason. They are such a serious threat because of the very nature of what they are. Permanently ending either of these two combatants is going to be an epic confrontation that would play out over a very long span of time. In fact, in this versus scenario, I don't think that Acererak and Tar-Baphon would be a single battle between the two. I think you're looking at an extended campaign as they go back and forth, as they find advantages. One gets a victory, the other gets a victory. I see this being an extended battle as both combatants struggle to find the right way to permanently put the other down. But on just about every front, Tar-Baphon wins here. First off, if you look at the comparative resistances and immunities that Tar-Baphon and Acererak has, Tar-Baphon just has more resistances and more immunities in general. There are fewer things that are capable of injuring him. Acererak is no slouch, he just doesn't have as much. So even if you did translate Acererak over into Pathfinder, you would find that compared to one another, Tar-Baphon comes out on top in that regard. Also, as mentioned in the equipment section, Tar-Baphon has the Horns of Nagara, which do increase the defenses he has at his disposal. So in regards to their base form, Acererak and Tar-Baphon are both very tough, they're both very durable, but Tar-Baphon is more durable overall. However, we are talking about liches, and if you talk about a lich, you gotta talk about the soul cage. Because putting a lich down once is not a victory. You put the lich down, and then you've got to find the soul cage and destroy it before the lich returns. And this is where it gets interesting between the two. I'm not aware for either of these two combatants that there has ever been an official publication of where to find the soul cage for Acererak or Tar-Baphon. As far as I know, that information does not exist. Hypothetically, Acererak has an advantage here in that he is a planar traveler. He has been to multiple planes, he has seen multiple places. Not only is his soul cage probably well defended, but it's also probably ridiculously well hidden. If nothing else, he likely has the whole of the negative energy plane at his disposal as possible places to store his soul cage. But here we do find that Tar-Baphon comes in with a little bit of a sneaky advantage. You may remember earlier I talked about Acererak has a bad habit of ditching allies. Acererak had a divine patron, a Vecna, but ultimately parted ways with Vecna. Tar-Baphon also has a divine patron, which is Urgathoa, the goddess of gluttony and undeath. And in the rumors surrounding Tar-Baphon, it is stated that the Shining Crusade believes that Urgathoa actually hid Tar-Baphon's soul cage for Tar-Baphon so that not even a god could find it. And when I have to decide between a soul cage hidden across a variety of planes or a soul cage hid with all of the cunning and power of a deity, I've got to give this one to Tar-Baphon. While it would not be easy, I feel like Tar-Baphon would have an easier time of finding Acererak's soul cage than Acererak would have of finding Tar-Baphon's. So, on the issue of survivability, both in the direct confrontation and in the finding and destroying of soul cages, I feel like Tar-Baphon has a clear advantage in this category. But that was defense. Let's talk offense. Which combatant is more powerful in a fight? Who can bring more damage to bear? Again, Acererak and Tar-Baphon are top tier in their respective settings. Both of these individuals can bring a lot of power to bear. On one hand, we see Acererak creating the death curse, corrupting resurrection magic across the entirety of a globe. That is an incredible display of necromantic power and definitely worthy of respect. On the other side, Tar-Baphon seems to be the pinnacle of the classic necromancer with a near instantaneous ability to bring creatures back as undead minions under his disposal, and it is specifically noted he has no limit to the number of undead that he can control. So Tar-Baphon is clearly not a slouch in this area. But who is more powerful? And this is where the conversation gets really interesting, and you start dealing in a lot of hypotheticals. I could see arguments going a lot of different ways here. You may remember I mentioned in D&D 3.0, 3.5, Acererak actually becomes a vestige. And again, that's kind of a hypothetical conversation. Exactly how powerful is a vestige? For purposes of this video, I'm putting the 3.5 vestige as roughly equivalent to a warlock or witch patron. I think that's probably about the same level. But feel free to disagree with me if you'd like to. Clearly, Acererak has achieved incredible power and can bestow incredible powers on others. But what about Tar-Baphon? Now, I've mentioned his stat block a few times, and you may remember CR23 versus CR26. I really am not considering those numbers as very important, but there is a number from his stat block that I think is critical in evaluating this part of the competition, and that is Mythic Rank 10. Mythic rules were Pathfinder 1st Edition's response to the concept of epic level play. And at present, they have not been reproduced in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, so we haven't seen what Mythic heroes look like for 2e yet, so we really don't have a point of comparison there. But in 1st Edition, Mythic rank, Mythic tier, that was the extreme of how you could push the power level of a player character or a threat that a PC might have to face. For those of you who have played the game Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, you may know that in that game, your characters can gain Mythic tiers, and the Mythic tiers cap out at Mythic tier 10. Well, in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, when you are at or around Mythic rank 7, it is possible inside of that game to get in a fight with a deity. Now, you don't kill the deity, but you can fight a deity and you can win the fight against a deity at Mythic rank 7. And Tar-Baphon is specifically noted at Mythic rank 10. This tells me that Tar-Baphon, while he is not a deity, punches at the deity level. The Whispering Tyrant can consistently swing at deity level threat, and that is an inherent part of his power. So, in regards to offense or necromantic power, I again find myself kind of giving the edge to Tar-Baphon here. Don't get me wrong, Acererak is clearly a powerful necromancer, and his accomplishments with the Death Curse are impressive, but the Death Curse is not a threat to Tar-Baphon. Meanwhile, Mythic Power could potentially turn a serious threat against Acererak. Additionally, it's worth noted that there are several occasions in Acererak's story where he has avoided trying to become a deity. He seems to have different goals. Exactly what he's trying to accomplish, we don't know, but he doesn't seem to be walking that path. Certainly whatever path he is on is comparable, but it also kind of feels like he's not as far along the path as Tar-Baphon has managed to walk. So overall here, because of Tar-Baphon capping out his Mythic rank inside of Pathfinder 1st Edition, I've got to give the offense or necromantic power to Tar-Baphon in this particular category. So that takes us through 5 different categories where I have nominated a winner in each of those categories. Tar-Baphon has taken 4 victories, and Acererak has taken 1. Tar-Baphon gets the edge with allies, equipment, survivability, and offense or necromantic power, but Acererak did take the win in the area of mastery of the environment, and I do want to stress that Acererak got the clearest victory of any of these categories in claiming the victory over mastery of environment. But there is one category that I haven't finished yet, and that is intelligence. You may remember way back in round 1 we talked about the cunning intellect of Acererak versus the focused or brutal intellect of Tar-Baphon, and now we need to ask what I think is the most critical question of all: which version of hyperintelligence wins? Because honestly, I think that this question can push the fight either direction. Now, for this conversation, I want to talk about combat sport theory, or you will see versions of this sometimes in game theory as well. But in combat sport theory, there is a way of viewing combat that sees every fighter as falling into one of 3 archetypes: aggressive combat, defensive combat, and trap fighting. Now, there is a ton of nuance that I am skipping over here, and please forgive me for doing so, but this video is already super long. But the rough version of this theory states that every fighter, while they may have a variety of skills from the 3 different types, will typically fall into one of those 3 types as their predominant approach to combat. And all other variables being equal, when you look at those 3 approaches to combat, that they are arranged in a very predictable fashion. So let's talk about Acererak and Tar-Baphon and where they tend to fall in this aggressive, defensive, or trap fighting style. Acererak, I think, is a trap fighter. I think that is hands down clear from the way he is presented. And, by the way, it's one of the reasons I think Acererak is such an interesting villain. Though he often fills that evil force of nature role, he has this cunning intellect that leads him to try to trap his opponent. He wants to lead his opponent into making a mistake, and then, when his opponent makes that mistake, he capitalizes on it. That's what trap fighters do, and I think that is very much how Acererak has been written across editions. I think it's a very consistent part of his character. Meanwhile, Tar-Baphon is a classic aggressive fighter. If you're like me and you're a fan of the Zerg and StarCraft, you know what I'm talking about. Aggressive styles focus on offense. They focus on taking the initiative. They focus on striking fast, striking hard, knocking an enemy off of their feet, and basically creating an advantage that will ultimately snowball into inevitable victory. Aggressive tactics can certainly be seen as simple, but they shouldn't be seen as foolish. They're direct, they're focused. The person who uses them knows what they want to do, how they want to do it, and they will often find the best, most painful route for their opponent to get there. So I think it's pretty safe to say Acererak is a classic example of a trap fighter, and Tar-Baphon is a classic example of an aggressive fighter. So, how do those stack up? Well, in combat sport theory, the aggressive fighter typically loses to the defensive fighter. The defensive fighter typically loses to the trap fighter, and the trap fighter typically loses to the aggressive fighter. The reason for this is fairly simple. The aggressive fighter typically moves too quickly and too directly for the traps of the trap fighter to be effective. The trap fighter is trying to control the fight, but the aggressive fighter is moving too quickly for that control to be established. Now, again, I am glossing over a ton of nuance here. This is a very big picture view, but in general, an aggressive fighter is going to win against a trap fighter, all other things being equal. So, in this instance, The focused intellect of Tar-Baphon is to his advantage, and I think gives him the edge. So that brings us to who's going to win in the fight, Acererak or Tar-Baphon? And, as you can probably tell by now, I think Tar-Baphon takes the win. The Whispering Tyrant is victorious, and I think Acererak the Devourer is ultimately defeated should these two go head-to-head. And if you've been following along in my arguments so far, you may have discovered that there is a very common theme to why I think the Whispering Tyrant wins this fight, which is most of Acererak's advantages are not advantages against Tar-Baphon. A simple example of this is in the equipment section. The Sphere of Annihilation is certainly a powerful artifact that Acererak has at his disposal, but because Tar-Baphon is a Lich, he is much less threatened by one of Acererak's main attacks. Additionally, because both combatants are Liches, Necromancy is of limited utility, one versus the other, so both combatants find themselves in a situation where their best offense is less effective against the opponent. This puts both combatants in a situation where they have to resort to less commonly used spells and less commonly used tactics in order to gain an edge, but you may remember in the survivability category, the Whispering Tyrant has access to the Horns of Nagara, which make him more resistant to a wider variety of damage, again making him harder to injure. Time and again, the advantages that Acererak seems to possess ultimately don't seem to be very effective against Tar-Baphon, but let's talk about the big one. Mastery of the environment. I do think this is a category where Acererak has a clear advantage, and if you want to pitch a scenario where Acererak wins this fight, this is definitely why he would win the fight. Acererak is, I think, much better at creating dungeons, much better at using the environment to his advantage, and has a broader experience with a variety of environments that just make him more dangerous in a wider range of scenarios. And, as I noted earlier, Tar-Baphon's personality is such he is more likely to engage Acererak in a situation where Acererak would have that tactical environmental advantage. So to be very clear, I do think Acererak has a clear-cut advantage on that front, but I do want to remind you that Tar-Baphon, as a human, did manage to find and defeat the Cenotaph, which was a necromantic dungeon designed by the Rune Lord of Necromancy, and ultimately Tar-Baphon became a more powerful necromancer than the Rune Lord of Necromancy. In other words, mortal Tar-Baphon has shown that he has the skill set to defeat the exact kind of dungeon that Acererak is associated with. In fact, I did a little bit of Googling and searching. The Tomb of Horrors is typically associated with level 10 to level 14 characters in its original design. The Tomb of Annihilation is associated with 10th level characters in D&D 5e. Well, the Cenotaph doesn't have a specific level range, but seems to be around level 12 to level 16. Which means Tar-Baphon, as a mortal, has conquered a dungeon comparable in power to what Acererak can produce. So you see, even in that category, the primary advantage that Acererak has is ultimately negated by the skill set we know that the Whispering Tyrant possesses. However, there is one final element of the discussion that I think really seals the conversation for me. And you may have noticed that in each of the rounds of this competition that I have mostly avoided mentioning the most powerful weapon at Tar-Baphon's disposal, Radiant Fire. During his containment in Gallowspire, the Whispering Tyrant was able to use one of the pieces of the Shattered Shield of Arnescent to obtain a powerful mastery over positive energy that was comparable to his mastery over negative energy. Acererak has no comparable ability in any of the sources that I have seen. And Tar-Baphon was able to take this mastery of positive energy, weaponize it in the form of Radiant Fire, which he has successfully turned against his enemies on several occasions. This is a weapon that is explicitly and terribly effective against Acererak, and something that I think really puts this fight in Tar-Baphon's corner. I think when you compare the individual elements that need to be considered, Tar-Baphon has consistent advantages that Acererak cannot match, and then if you give Tar-Baphon his greatest weapon, there is just nothing that Acererak can bring to bear that is nearly as potent as what the Whispering Tyrant has at his disposal. So, winner, Tar-Baphon the Whispering Tyrant. But those are just my conclusions. I'm curious to hear what you think about this potential matchup. So, let me turn the conversation over to you. Who do you think would win in a fight between Acererak the Devourer and Tar-Baphon the Whispering Tyrant? I think both of these villains are incredible villains. I think they're a lot of fun to read about. I think they're a lot of fun to use. And I'm really glad as a storyteller that I have access to these excellent characters. But I'm curious to hear how you think the fight would go down between these two legendary combatants. So jump into the comments section and let me know. Do you agree with my evaluation? Do you think Tar-Baphon would win the fight? Or do you think that there is something that I missed that would put the fight in Acererak's corner instead? Also, let me know what elements of the battle I might have overlooked in coming up with this evaluation. I look forward to hearing what you all have to say. Also, while you're down there, let me know if you're interested in more videos like this. Would you like me to pair up other villains or heroes from TTRPGs and see how they compare against one another? I'm not going to lie, I've been seriously considering a Charladon versus Minkare as a possible follow-up, so if you're interested, let me know. Also, don't forget all of the other YouTube stuff. Like the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, check out my Discord, my Patreon, do all of the stuff that helps to keep this channel growing. Thank you so much for being here, thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.